And now a moment from Your History and Health starts first with Dr. Richard Brown.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Your History and Health Comes First by Dr. Richard Brown. Today's podcast is going to focus on a couple of different subjects. Hopefully they'll be entertaining for you. It is January 19, 2022. And we're more than halfway through the first month of the new year. But we continue to struggle with the issues and the problems related to health and health disparities, as well as the coronavirus from last year. So the battle is still before us. The struggle is still upon us. But let me begin by talking a little bit about Dr. Martin Luther King, since he is usually the focus of Black History Month. And February, coming up in about a couple of weeks, being the shortest month of the year, is also Black History Month, of course. And Martin Luther King is usually the focus of topics and discussions and speeches by both the conservatives and the liberals, those on the left, those on the right. We seem to have an individual who people can relate to and have agreement on, although everybody does not celebrate the King holiday. It was a national holiday, I believe, since 1986. Some people don't still celebrate it. Some people have to work. Some organizations work. Some organizations do not work on that day. And so that right there could say something about the divisiveness that still exists within our country relative to race relations. However, so we celebrate the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King each year. And his legacy should be our goal to do what he aspired to, what his philosophy was about. And his job, his philosophy, his life was based upon improving the health of people. It was based upon improving quality of life. It focused on inequality and injustices. And of course, we still got a lot of that going on today. But on March 25th, 1966 in Chicago, during a press conference at the second convention of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, Dr. King said these words, which you've heard over and over and over before. He said, of all forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. Let me say that again. Of all forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. We still have some issues with that over 100 years, almost 100 years later. This quote speaks to the heart of my professional journey, which has been to effectively promote the reduction of health disparities throughout the organizations I've served in, which are many senior management positions. And it underscores my interest in working inside healthcare delivery systems in the United States to try and provide healthcare to those who aren't as powerful or who don't have the means to speak powerfully for themselves. We know, though, that the most powerful influence of any organization is the board of directors and executive leadership, because of the decisions that they make to deliver their mission and to serve the community. So diversity and inclusion, which is talked a lot about these days, in the C-suite or in the boardroom is very, very key to eradicating health disparities and inequalities, especially in communities of color. Now, during these times that we're in, which are very tumultuous, both politically and as we make decisions about how to eliminate the coronavirus and the pandemic, people are always asking that question. I'm sure you've heard, well, what would Jesus do? Okay, well, what would King do? What would Dr. King do is what I've heard people say as they look at the civil rights issues and the problems with voter suppression and all that. And so I was thinking about this, and my thoughts was that, well, we know what Jesus did. We do know that he did a lot of walking. because there was no automobiles, there was no trains, there was not a means of transportation whereby you could do much other than walk. There certainly were no airplanes, right? So we also know that Dr. King did a lot of walking as well, as he marched from city to city, fighting against voter suppression, fighting against people who did not want Black folk to vote and poor people to vote. He was all about health equality and health equity and all about civil rights. So we know both of these icons and gentlemen that we talk about in the history of the world, actually, we know both of them were soldiers for saving humanity and promoting health equity. Therefore, I believe when we ask the question, what would they do? I believe they'd be in favor of the science that drives the fact that we should be taking the vaccine. I believe they would be in favor of wearing masks to protect the population. So as we continue with an increase in the coronavirus cases, which are killing people by the thousands each day, and we've got the Omicron variant, and there may be another variant coming, we know that physical activity is very, very important. And of course, walking is the easiest thing you can do to promote physical activity. It doesn't take very much at all to do some walking. If you got legs, then you can do it. So let me begin by saying that what I want to go to now today and probably over another session or two is to talk about the African Americans' contribution to medicine, okay? So Africans have contributed to all aspects of life on this planet, as you know. Some people don't want to believe it, but reputable scientific research has proven that all life began on the continent of Africa, where there are now 54 countries that was colonized by Great Britain, France, Portugal, and Spain beginning in the 1600s. So the first Africans were brought to America and enslaved, first to cut sugarcane and then later for picking cotton in the southern states. So let me ask a couple of questions which you can answer for yourself. How many of you have ever seen water fountains labeled white and colored? Well, those of you who were born back in the 40s and 50s, you've seen it. Those of you who were born perhaps in the 60s and beyond have not seen that. Well, I've seen that. How many of you have seen the KKK in person, dressed in robes and in masks? Well, I've seen that, but many of you may not have seen that, so you do not necessarily understand the gravity of that group, of the fear that group puts in the minds of people of color. How many of you have been set on fire by a racist white person? Probably not many of you. Probably most of you have not endured that, but I have. How many of you enrolled in a Black history course? Why? Why not? Well, many of you probably have not. When I was coming along in college back in the late 60s, early 70s, there was no Black history courses. There are some now, and those who are in college should enroll in that history because it is significant. It is different from the history that you've been taught and you have been told about. So why are African Americans at the bottom of the economic and health indicators in the United States? Why is that? I struggled with that for many, many years as a young teenager and as a young adult. I could not understand why it was that we were on the bottom of everything. I knew lots of smart African Americans, both male and female. Matter of fact, the women were more smart than the males, especially in school. They made the highest grades. They exercised, some thinking that was of the highest level, in my opinion. So why do Black women represent only 2% of physicians in the United States? Once again, women, Black women, very smart. Matter of fact, the most educated group of people in the United States is Black women. That's statistically true. You can Google it and look it up. So Black physicians had to drive ambulances and teach school and do other things because they could not get an appointment in some cases and practice their medicine. But there's lots of firsts that took place. And so we made it through and did a phenomenal job of succeeding in the odds of some serious odds. So let's see. I want to read something for you that I've come across. I do not know who the author is. I have got to find out who the author is, and I'm sure someone knows, but it is phenomenal to read, and it is good information for everybody, both Black, white, young, old, it doesn't matter. But it speaks to truth and it speaks to facts. So let me read this for you. So you mean to tell me that someone down your ancestry line survived being chained to other human bodies for several months in the bottom of a disease-infested ship during the Middle Ages, during the Middle Passage, lost their language, customs, and traditions, picked up English language as best they could while working free of charge from sunup to sundown as they watched babies sold from out of their arms and women raped by ruthless slave owners, took names, with no last names, no birth certificates, no heritage of any kind. They braved the Underground Railroad, survived the civil rights to enter into sharecropping. They learned to read and write out of sheer will and determination, faced the burning crosses of the KKK, averted their eyes at the Black bodies swinging from ropes hung on trees, fought in world wars as soldiers to return to America as boys, marched in Birmingham, hosed in Selma, jailed in Wilmington, assassinated in Memphis, segregated in the South, ghettoed in the North, ignored in history books, stereotyped in Hollywood, and in spite of it all, someone in your family line endured every era to make sure that you would get here. And you receive one rejection, face one obstacle, you lose one friend, you get overlooked, and you want to quit. How dare you entertain the very thought of quitting? People you never knew survived from generation to generation so that you could succeed. Don't you dare let them down. Give this to your young people who don't know their history and want to be weak and who want to quit. It is not in our DNA to quit. That is a profound statement that I think we should all think about. And I think it'll help us move forward as we're in a struggle now and a continuous war against racism and misogynism and other forms of isms that seem to continue to plague our US and the planet. There are many people who believe that Trump represents those people who want to continue to resurrect or perpetuate Jim Crow laws that was established in 1865. 1865, this took place after so-called African Americans were freed, but the Southern Confederates continued to place these laws in place to keep Blacks in their place. It seems that hate appears to be directed to all who are not white or who practice Christianity. They're against Blacks, Hispanics, Native American, East Indian, Asian immigrants, Muslim, gay community, and Jews. There's a serious hatred that's been around, it's still around, and there's need to do all that we can to try and fight this hatred because it's not right. It's not what Jesus would do. It's not what Dr. Martin Luther King would do. Jim Crow laws. Many of you young people out there may not know what Jim Crow laws are. There's many older people out there who do not know what Jim Crow laws are. There's many older people out there who have lived through Jim Crow. And actually, in some cases, we're still living through some Jim Crow laws. So let me read for you what Jim Crow is, for those of you who do not know. And you might recognize it as happening today, or you may have seen it in the past. So beginning in 1865, after the Civil War there was a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. Named after a minstrel show character, the laws, which existed for about 100 years from the post-Civil War era until 1968, they were meant to marginalize African Americans by denying them the right to vote, hold jobs, get an education, or other opportunities. Those who attempted to defy Jim Crow laws often faced arrest, fines, jail sentences, violence, and even death. The codes appeared throughout the South as a legal way to put Black citizens into indentured servitude, to take voting rights away, to control where they lived and how they traveled, and to seize their children for labor purposes. They could take your children from you because you were African American. This was part of the Jim Crow laws. The legal system was stacked against Black citizens with former Confederate soldiers working as police and judges. Okay, the former Confederate soldiers who fought against the United States and lost, they became the police, they became the judges. They did everything they could to make it difficult for the African American to win court cases. And they made sure that those codes stay in place. These codes worked in conjunction with the labor camps for the incarcerated, where prisoners were treated as enslaved people. Black offenders typically received longer sentences than their white equal, and because of the grueling work, often did not live out their entire sentences. Every year, at least one or two, maybe more, African Americans are released from prison because it was found, either through DNA or other means, that they were not guilty of the crime that they were sentenced for. So the Jim Crow laws continue to exist in some form. Also, I want to mention something about the January insurrection, which took place just a little over a year ago. Lots of talk about that. Those who are intelligent, who are sane, those who are rational, those who are woke, understand what happened, that there's a group of people that tried to overtake the federal government. They tried to change the government because their candidate didn't win. They tried to make the people believe that the election wasn't fair. And the process for ensuring that the election was final, where they counted the actual votes from the states, they tried to interrupt it. Do you know how many groups were there that came together in this country to overthrow this government and to cause that insurrection? Many do not know. You've probably heard of some of these you're familiar with, but there were 9 groups that came together in a coordinated effort to overthrow the democratic process. There was the KKK, which has been around since 1865. There was a group called the Boogaloo Boys. Hadn't heard of them. There was the neo-Nazis. There were the skinheads. There was the QAnon, which came along in 2018. There were white nationalists. There were the Proud Boys. There were the Oath Keepers. Matter of fact, one of the Oath Keepers have just been indicted a few days ago. And then there was the alt-right group, which came along in 2020. So many whites, it seems, Trump supporters, believe that people of color have assumed too much power, which threatens their system of white supremacy and racism. They will fight to their death against those who oppose them. And as did the 6 million that fought in the Civil War that ended in 1865, where 600,000 lives were lost. So if there's anyone out there who do not believe that we're in the midst of a serious social war, war against people of color, then let me assure you that it is happening. It is very, very true. So what I want to do at this point is to begin to talk specifically about the African Americans who have contributed to healthcare, because basically, as you know, health is the most important thing that you can spend your time with and spend your time on. If you don't have health, then you can't do much else except try and get your health back. So many African Americans have participated and contributed to the healthcare system, which many of you may or may not know about. And I wish to, at this point, to begin to talk about them. Now, we're going to take the topic from the beginning, and we're going to work it through to where we bring it all the way up to the current. But we're going to start back at 1619, when the first Africans were brought to this shore. Now, there's a book out entitled 1619, which you may be familiar with. I would encourage those who have not to start reading that book. It is very, very thick. I think it's over 500 pages, but it tells about the history that you never heard about, that you never knew about, a history that has been hidden. And I would suggest that you perhaps get a copy of that and take a look. So we know, first of all, that 1619 is when the first African Americans came to Virginia. And it's interesting that the politician whose name is Manchin is from Virginia, who's blocking the progress where Black folk are concerned in terms of voter rights and the voter depression. So 400 years ago, the first African Americans came to the shores of America in Virginia. And that was in 1619. So in 1861 to 1865, there was the Civil War between the North and the South over slavery. 600 lives were lost. These are the Northern people and the Southern people. For the most part, these are white people fighting among themselves, as they continue to do today. 600 lives were lost, 1861 to 1865. In 1865, as I mentioned already, even though the war was lost, the slaves were freed, but in the Southern states, they continued to keep Black folk in slavery. And this is when the Jim Crow era came along, between 1865 all the way to 1968. So over 100 years, they continued with the Jim Crow laws, which I mentioned and talked to you about earlier today. In 1866, the KKK was established in Tennessee by the Confederate veterans. Now, the war was over in 1865. So in 1866, 1 year later, that's when the KKK got established. And there's movies out there on that. There's books written on that. And as I mentioned earlier, if you had never seen the KKK, you may not ever see them with their robes and their masks, but you probably see a lot of them on a daily basis because they're not wearing their masks anymore. They're wearing suits and ties and uniforms and carrying batons and weapons. 1867 is the Reconstruction period. This is where they were trying to reconstruct the country as it had been divided, had the Civil War, so they wanted to try and reconstruct it. This began in 1867. This was to help former slaves to gain political positions, education, to gain economic power. And so they decided, this is our federal government and some other smart people decided that, well, in order to be fair, after this war, we've kept these people in slavery for all these years. In order to be fair, why don't we, after we let these folk go, let's give them something that they could use to uplift themselves, to become economically viable, just like the rest of the country is. So they decided that they would give African Americans who were released from these plantations 40 acres and a mule. General Sherman, this was his edict. This was his position. This is what he wanted to do after the war. Well, of course, we know that there weren't many people, if any, who got their 40 acres and a mule, because the Congress changed, the government changed, and the people that got into office after this time period changed and said, nope, we're not going to do that. And so it didn't happen. So then in 1870, there was the 15th Amendment, which gave Blacks the right to vote. Before then, we did not have the right to vote. 15th Amendment gave Black folk the right to vote. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education prohibited segregation in public schools. 1954, which is not so long ago. They decided that segregation wasn't right. It was prohibited in public schools. 1964, the year that I graduated from high school, there was the Civil Rights Act that was passed to make voting easier for the African Americans to vote. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act passed, and the limitations on African Americans voting was stopped. And here we are in 2021 and 22. We're back at people, government, politicians, states, for the most part, are trying to restrict African Americans from voting. They're trying to make it more difficult. And so if you don't believe that we're in a serious war, a war that in the past have been fought time and time again, and which may have to be fought again, it's still with us. And so it is very important for you to understand what that is all about, what the war is all about. Understand the history of Black people in this country, that we were not allowed to read, we were not allowed to keep our children, we were not allowed to marry, we were not allowed to stay together as families. But when we finally got free, we still never was free because they continued with the Jim Crow laws. So then in 75 to 1950, there's a person by the name of Carter Woodson who decided that he was going to create Black History Month. He was a historian. And so I'm going to talk about him next time and talk about the Black History Month, why it exists, who's involved with it, why it needs to continue and should be expanded. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I want to thank you for attending this week's podcast. And remember, your history and your health comes first, and always participate in physical activity if you can. And finally, I want to share with you again my book entitled Mission Unstoppable. This is a book made up of 32 authors who have been successful in entrepreneurship and business, and who tell their story about how difficult it was to achieve success and become millionaires, in some cases billionaires, but also tell you the steps they took and how they overcame the barriers and became successful. So you can obtain this book if you decide to at www.leebrownassociates.com. That's www.leebrownassociates.com. Mission Unstoppable. Extraordinary stories of failure's blessings. Thank you very much. We'll see you next time. Okay, I'm out.
This has been Your History and Health Starts First with Dr. Richard Brown. And you can leave suggestions at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.